The day we buried my father, my older brother handed me an eviction notice. He didn't realize he was trying to kick me out of a building I had legally owned for the last 5 years. It was raining, the kind of cold, relentless drizzle that makes black umbrellas look like a flock of damp crows clustered around a hole in the ground. Carter waited exactly 14 minutes after the priest threw the first handful of dirt before pulling the folded piece of paper from the inside pocket of his tailored Tom Ford suit. He handed it to me without making eye contact, his eyes fixed somewhere over my left shoulder, probably calculating the value of the cemetery plots. I looked down at the paper. It was a standard 30-day notice to vacate the premises of Ellis Auto Care, the shop where I had spent the last 20 years of my life with grease under my fingernails and the smell of brake cleaner in my lungs. Carter adjusted his silk tie and cleared his throat, finally looking at me. "I've already listed the business, Jake," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, corporate baritone he used when he wanted to sound authoritative. "A commercial developer has been eyeing that corner for a year. They want to put up a mixed-use complex, coffee shops, luxury condos, that sort of thing. I need you to have your toolboxes cleared out by the end of the month so the demolition crew can get in." I didn't yell. I didn't throw a punch. I just carefully folded the paper, slipped it into the breast pocket of my cheap suit, and nodded. In my family, anger was a luxury I couldn't afford, and words were usually weapons used against me, so I kept my mouth shut. I knew something Carter didn't. I knew that you can't sell a piece of earth you don't actually own. To understand the arrogance of my brother, you have to understand the arithmetic of our family. My father, Richard Ellis, was a man who spoke through his hands. He built his auto repair business from a single-bay garage into a massive 6-bay operation on a prime corner lot in a neighborhood that used to be strictly blue-collar but was rapidly becoming trendy. Dad was a master mechanic but a terrible accountant. He poured every dime back into the shop, keeping prices low for neighborhood folks who couldn't afford dealership rates. Carter, 5 years older than me, took one look at the oil-stained concrete and decided he wanted a life with air conditioning and stock options. Dad paid for Carter's business degree at a private university, taking out a second mortgage on the house to do it. Carter graduated, moved into a glass office downtown, and only came around on holidays to complain about the smell of our work boots. I stayed. I learned to rebuild transmissions, diagnose electrical ghosts, and run the floor. For 20 years, I was the first one to turn the lights on at 5:00 a.m. and the last one to lock the bay doors. I never asked for a piece of the pie. I just wanted to keep the wheels turning. But 5 years ago, the arithmetic caught up with Dad. A balloon payment on a predatory commercial loan he'd taken out to buy new diagnostic equipment came due, and the bank wasn't interested in extending his terms. He needed $300,000 in cash, or they were going to foreclose on the property. Dad was too proud to ask Carter, knowing Carter would just tell him to declare bankruptcy and liquidate. He was sitting in the dark office one night, staring at a stack of red-stamped envelopes, looking older than I had ever seen him. That was the night I made my move. Unlike Dad, I didn't spend money. I lived in a small apartment above a hardware store, drove a 20-year-old truck that ran like a sewing machine, and invested every paycheck I had earned since I was 18. I knew the market and I knew the value of that corner lot. I sat down across from him, pushed a mug of black coffee across the desk, and offered him a way out. I wouldn't give him the money as a gift. His pride wouldn't allow that. Instead, I proposed a business transaction. I had formed an anonymous limited liability company called Ironwood Holdings a month prior. I told Dad that Ironwood would purchase the physical property, the dirt, the concrete, the building for a fair market value of $400,000 in cash. That would pay off his loan and leave him a comfortable cushion. In exchange, Ironwood would execute a 99-year master commercial leaseback to Ellis Auto Care Inc. The terms of the lease were the masterpiece. I structured it as an absolute triple net lease. The business would pay a token rent of $1,000 a month, plus taxes and insurance, as long as Richard Ellis or his designated working partner, me, was operating the shop. But I included a very specific change of control clause. If the ownership of the business entity ever transferred to someone outside the daily operations, Or if the business attempted to sublease or sell, the protective rent cap instantly evaporated. The lease would revert to month. The rent would immediately adjust to triple the current market rate for commercial zoning in that zip code, and the landlord held the unilateral right to terminate the lease with 0 days notice for non-compliance. Dad read the contract, looked at me with a mixture of shock and deep, quiet respect, and signed it. We transferred the deed quietly at the county assessor's office. Ellis Auto Care Incorporated continued to operate exactly as it always had. On paper, Dad owned the business name, the customer list, and the wrenches, but I owned the ground underneath his boots. We never told Carter. There was no need to. Fast forward to the week after the funeral. The reading of the will took place in the mahogany-paneled office of a family lawyer who had clearly never held a wrench in his life. The document was an old one, drafted over a decade ago, long before Dad's financial crisis. It stated plainly and simply that the entirety of Ellis Auto Care Incorporated was to be left to his eldest son, Carter Ellis, to manage and grow the family legacy, while I was left a sum of $10,000 and Dad's vintage Mustang. Carter sat across the table, trying and failing to hide a smug smile. He assumed, as most corporate guys do, that owning the corporation meant owning everything the corporation touched. He didn't bother to conduct a title search on the real estate. Why would he? He thought he was the smartest guy in the room. "I'll have the 10 grand wired to your account by Friday, Jake," Carter said, adjusting his cuffs. "And like I said at the cemetery, you have until the end of the month to clear out. I've already signed a letter of intent with Horizon Development. They're acquiring the business assets and the property for $3.2 million. It's a clean exit. Dad would have wanted us to capitalize on the market." I looked at the lawyer. "Does the estate include the physical real estate?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and skimmed the document. "The will transfers all shares of Ellis Auto Care Incorporated to Carter. Whatever assets the corporation holds are now his." Neither of them knew that the corporation held nothing but a stack of invoices, a bunch of aging hydraulic lifts, and a lease agreement. I nodded, stood up, and shook Carter's hand. "Good luck with the sale, Carter," I said. For the next 3 weeks, I went to work like nothing had changed. The atmosphere in the shop, however, became unbearable. Carter started showing up at noon in his leased BMW, trailing real estate agents and men in hard hats holding clipboards. They would walk through my bays while I was actively rebuilding engines, pointing at the load-bearing walls and talking about where the espresso bar would go. Carter treated me like a rogue employee who was overstaying his welcome. He sent me daily emails, which I promptly printed and filed in a thick manila folder, reminding me of the eviction date and threatening to have my personal toolboxes seized if I didn't comply. He even brought in a liquidator to tag the lifts and air compressors with little neon auction stickers. I let them do it. I let them measure the windows and test the soil. I meticulously logged every hour I worked, packed my personal, specialized tools into my truck each night, and waited. In my line of work, timing is everything. You don't try to turn a bolt until you have the socket seated perfectly, or you'll strip the head. I was waiting for the socket to seat. The climax arrived on a Thursday morning, 2 days before my supposed eviction. Carter had scheduled a massive walkthrough with the primary investors from Horizon Development. They wanted to do a final handshake on the property before drawing up the binding purchase agreement. There were 6 of them in the shop, standing in a circle near Bay 3, wearing expensive overcoats that smelled like dry cleaning fluid, trying not to step in puddles of coolant. Carter was holding court, holding a glossy architectural rendering of the glass and steel monstrosity they planned to build. I wiped my hands on a shop rag, grabbed my manila folder from the office, and walked over to the group. Carter saw me approaching and sighed, putting on his best patronizing smile. "Jake, we're in the middle of an executive meeting here. I thought I told you to start loading your truck." "I just needed to drop off some paperwork regarding the property transfer," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient hum of the air compressor. The lead developer, a silver-haired guy with a shark smile, extended his hand. "Ah, the brother. Carter told us you were the muscle behind the operation." It's a prime piece of real estate you boys have here. Sorry to see the old shop go, but progress marches on, right? Progress is great, I said, shaking his hand. But I think there's been a slight miscommunication regarding the inventory of this sale. I turned to Carter and handed him the folder. You might want to review the master lease before you promise these gentlemen a demolition date. Carter frowned, snatching the folder. What lease? Dad owned the building free and clear. It's an asset of the corporation. It was, I corrected mildly. Until 5 years ago, when he sold the land and the building to a private holding company to avoid foreclosure. The color drained from Carter's face as he opened the folder. On top was a certified copy of the quitclaim deed, stamped by the county clerk, showing the transfer of the property from Richard Ellis to Ironwood Holdings LLC. Beneath that was the master lease agreement. Ironwood Holdings? Carter muttered, his eyes darting across the legal jargon. Who the hell is Ironwood Holdings? I am, I said. I pulled my state ID from my wallet and tapped the document where my signature sat on the line for managing member. And as the property owner, I have a few updates regarding your tenancy. If you look at section 4, paragraph B, the change of control clause, since Ellis Auto Care Incorporated has officially transferred ownership to a party outside of daily operations, the subsidized rent agreement is null and void. The silver-haired developer stopped smiling. He looked at Carter, then at me. Wait a minute. You don't own the dirt? He asked Carter, his voice suddenly sharp. I own the business, Carter stammered, flipping frantically through the pages. The will gave me the business. And a business needs a place to operate, I continued, speaking clearly so everyone in the circle could hear the arithmetic settling into place. As of your inheritance, Carter, the rent on this facility adjusted to the current commercial market rate, plus a penalty for unauthorized intent to sublease or sell. I've done the market analysis. You owe Ironwood Holdings $32,000 for this month's rent, payable immediately. Carter looked like he had been hit in the chest with a tire iron. $32,000? That's extortion. You can't do this. It's a legally binding commercial lease, executed by the previous owner of your corporation, I said, entirely unbothered. Furthermore, since you clearly intend to cease automotive operations and attempt to sell property you do not own, you are in material breach of the lease's permitted use clause. So, behind the lease, you'll find a document of my own. Carter flipped the page with trembling fingers. It was an eviction notice. Not a polite 30-day request, but a 3-day commercial notice to quit for breach of contract and failure to pay adjusted rent. I don't want your corporation, Carter, I said quietly, looking him dead in the eyes. I don't want Dad's old tax liabilities. And I don't want the worn-out lifts. You own the name. You own the neon sign out front. But you don't own the concrete. And you don't own the walls. So I suggest you figure out how to move your corporation off my property by Monday morning, or I'll have the sheriff lock the doors and seize your business assets to cover the unpaid rent. The silence in the shop was absolute, broken only by the steady drip of a leaky faucet in the corner. The developers didn't say a word. They didn't need to. They were professionals. They knew a dead deal when they saw one. The silver-haired man gave Carter a look of profound disgust, shook his head, and walked out the rolling doors, his entourage trailing right behind him. The $3.2 million mirage vanished into the damp morning air. Carter stood there, clutching the folder, his tailored suit suddenly looking completely out of place in my garage. He tried to speak, to threaten a lawsuit, to scream, but the absolute, airtight reality of the documents suffocated the words in his throat. He had spent his whole life treating me like a stepping stone, assuming my silence was stupidity, assuming my calloused hands meant I couldn't read a ledger. He was learning in real time that unwritten entitlement doesn't hold up against a notarized signature. 2 weeks later, Ellis Auto Care Incorporated filed for bankruptcy. Carter couldn't afford to move the heavy equipment, and he certainly couldn't afford my rent. In the liquidation proceedings, Ironwood Holdings purchased the business name, the customer database, and all the physical equipment at auction for pennies on the dollar. effectively wiping out the least debt Carter owed me. I never changed the sign out front. I just unlocked the doors on a Tuesday morning, turned on the air compressor, and went back to work. I don't wear a suit and I don't have an MBA. But every time I walk across the oil-stained concrete, feeling the solid ground beneath my boots, I know exactly what I'm worth on paper, and I know exactly who owns the dirt.